At 5:29 in the morning on July 16, 1945, in the desert of New Mexico, a group of scientists watched a light appear on the horizon that was brighter than the sun. They had been working toward this moment for 3 years. They had known, intellectually, what they were building. They had done the mathematics. They had run the simulations. They had signed the papers and collected the paychecks and eaten dinner every night and slept in their beds, and now, at 5:29 in the morning in the New Mexico desert, they understood for the first time what they had actually done. Robert Oppenheimer, the director of the Manhattan Project, watched the light and thought of a line from Hindu scripture: "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." Kenneth Bainbridge, the test director, turned to Oppenheimer and said something less poetic: "Now we are all sons of bitches." They were right. Both of them. The bomb that exploded over the New Mexico desert that morning, codenamed Trinity, released energy equivalent to 21,000 tons of TNT. 3 weeks later, a bomb of similar design was dropped on Hiroshima. 70,000 people died instantly. Another 70,000 died within months from radiation. 3 days after that, a second bomb fell on Nagasaki. 40,000 dead in the first seconds. The war ended within a week. The United States was the only country on Earth with nuclear weapons. That lasted exactly 4 years. On August 29, 1949, the Soviet Union detonated its first nuclear device in the Kazakh steppe. The test was codenamed First Lightning by the Americans, who detected it from atmospheric sampling aircraft. In Moscow, it was called RDS-1. Stalin had been told it would take the Americans 10 years to develop the bomb. It had taken 4. The Soviets, with critical intelligence gathered by spies embedded in the Manhattan Project itself, had done it in 4 as well. The race had begun. What followed was the most dangerous arms buildup in human history. By 1950, the United States had 299 nuclear weapons. By 1960, that number had risen to 18,000. The Soviet Union, starting later and with fewer resources, nonetheless built 1,600 warheads by 1960 and would eventually surpass the Americans in total warhead count. At the peak of the Cold War in the mid-1980s, the two superpowers together possessed over 60,000 nuclear weapons, enough to kill every human being on Earth 12 times over. 12 times. The logic of this buildup had a name: mutually assured destruction. MAD. If either side launched, the other would launch in retaliation, and both civilizations would cease to exist. The theory was that this made nuclear war impossible, because no rational leader would initiate a conflict that guaranteed their own annihilation. The theory was elegant. It had one fatal flaw. It assumed that every decision would be made by rational people, with accurate information, under normal circumstances, with adequate time to think. None of those conditions were ever reliably met. What you are about to hear is the true story of the moments when the theory failed, when the information was wrong, when the people were not rational, when the time ran out, and when the world survived not because of the system, but despite it. In almost every case, survival came down to one person. One person who saw something, or refused something, or decided something, in the dark, alone, without anyone telling them what to do. Most of those people are not in your history book. It is 1950, and the Cold War is 5 years old, and it is already trying to become a hot one. On June 25th, North Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel and pour into South Korea. Within 3 days, Seoul has fallen. The United Nations, led by the United States, authorizes a military response. General Douglas MacArthur, the most decorated American soldier alive, the man who accepted Japan's surrender on the deck of the USS Missouri, the man who genuinely believed himself to be one of the great figures of history, is appointed Supreme Commander. MacArthur is 70 years old. He has not lost a war. He does not intend to start now. The Korean War goes badly, then brilliantly, then catastrophically. MacArthur's amphibious landing at Incheon in September 1950 is a masterpiece. UN forces cut the North Korean supply lines, recapture Seoul, and push north toward the Yalu River, the border with China. MacArthur tells President Truman the war will be over by Christmas. On October 19, 1950, 300,000 Chinese soldiers cross the Yalu River into Korea. They move at night. They use no radios. They communicate with bugles and drums. UN forces, expecting nothing, are caught completely unprepared. The result is one of the most catastrophic defeats in American military history. Entire divisions are surrounded, destroyed, or forced into desperate retreats through frozen mountain passes in temperatures of -30 degrees Celsius. MacArthur is furious. He wants to bomb Chinese supply lines inside China. He wants to use nationalist Chinese forces from Taiwan. He wants to blockade the Chinese coast. He wants, in short, to expand the war, to fight China directly, not just its proxies in Korea. Truman says no. The fear, the entirely rational fear, is that expanding the war against China draws in the Soviet Union, and a conventional war between the superpowers becomes a nuclear one. MacArthur does not accept this answer. He begins writing public letters contradicting American foreign policy. He communicates directly with Republican congressmen, undermining the administration's negotiating position. He sends a letter to the House Republican leaders saying that there is no substitute for victory, a direct repudiation of Truman's limited war strategy. And then there is the nuclear question. MacArthur requests, formally, in writing, the authority to use nuclear weapons at his own discretion. He wants 26 atomic bombs. His plan, reconstructed from documents declassified decades later, involves dropping them on Chinese cities and military installations and laying a belt of radioactive cobalt along the Yalu River to prevent Chinese reinforcement, a radioactive barrier that would remain lethal for decades. He does not get them. Truman fires him on April 11, 1951, relieving him of command for insubordination. MacArthur returns to the United States to a hero's welcome. Ticker tape parades in New York. An address to Congress. He gives a speech in which he quotes an old barracks ballad. Old soldiers never die, they just fade away. He fades away. The nuclear bombs stay in their silos. But here is what the history books rarely emphasize. MacArthur was not a lone lunatic. His request was not dismissed as obviously insane. The Joint Chiefs of Staff, the highest military command in the United States, considered his nuclear proposals seriously. Some of them agreed with him. The use of nuclear weapons in Korea was a live option, discussed at the highest levels of the American government for most of the war. What stopped it was not the system. It was one man, Harry S. Truman, a haberdasher from Missouri who had never finished college, who looked at the most celebrated general in America and said, no. The Korean War ends in 1953 in an armistice, not a peace treaty. The two Koreas still technically at war today are a direct legacy of that decision. So is the fact that no nuclear weapon has been used in combat since Nagasaki. October 27, 1961. Checkpoint Charlie. Berlin. You are standing at the most dangerous border crossing on Earth. On one side, American tanks. On the other side, Soviet tanks. 17 American M48 Pattons face 17 Soviet T-54s across a strip of pavement 100 meters wide. The tank commanders are watching each other through their scopes. Their guns are loaded. Their engines are running. This standoff has been building for 3 months. In August 1961, the East German government, with Soviet approval, begins constructing the Berlin Wall. The wall cuts the city in half overnight, separating families, trapping people on the wrong side, and sealing off the primary escape route through which 3.5 million East Germans had already fled to the West. The West protests loudly and does nothing physically to stop the construction. But the status of West Berlin remains legally complex. Under post-war agreements, American, British, and French officials have the right to move freely throughout the entire city, including the Soviet sector. The East Germans, asserting sovereignty over their half of Berlin, begin demanding that Western officials show identification at Checkpoint Charlie before crossing. The Americans refuse. Showing ID to East German border guards would implicitly recognize East German sovereignty over the crossing, a legal concession the Americans are unwilling to make. The standoff escalates through October, with American diplomat E. Alan Leitner being physically blocked from crossing and escorted through by U.S. military police. On October 25th, American tanks move to Checkpoint Charlie. Soviet tanks respond by moving to within 100 meters on the other side. For 16 hours, the two most powerful military forces on Earth sit with their guns pointed at each other across 100 meters of Berlin pavement. Neither side has clear orders for what to do if the other fires first. The standoff ends not through diplomacy, but through a back channel. A secret communication between Robert Kennedy and Soviet intelligence officer Georgy Bolshakov, arranged without the knowledge of most of the American national security apparatus. The Soviets agree to pull their tanks back 100 meters if the Americans do the same first. The Americans do. The Soviets follow. Both sides claim they moved second. What almost happened at Checkpoint Charlie was not a planned nuclear exchange. It was an accident, a misunderstanding, an overzealous local commander, a diplomat with too much pride and not enough information, that could have produced a conventional firefight between American and Soviet forces on German soil. And in 1961, a conventional war in Europe between the superpowers had, by all planning documents of the era, approximately a 70% chance of going nuclear within 72 hours. The person who resolved it was Robert Kennedy, 35 years old, the Attorney General, a man with no formal foreign policy role, making phone calls through an intelligence back channel that technically didn't exist. October 16, 1962, 8:45 in the morning. The White House. National Security Advisor McGeorge Bundy walks into President Kennedy's bedroom and tells him that the Soviet Union has been secretly installing nuclear missiles in Cuba, 90 miles from the coast of Florida. The missiles, when operational, will be capable of striking Washington, New York, and virtually every major American city within minutes of launch. There will be no warning time. There will be no opportunity to intercept. Kennedy gets out of bed. He has known for years that something like this was possible. He did not believe the Soviets would actually do it. He stares at the photographs from the U-2 reconnaissance aircraft, long rectangular shapes on the Cuban landscape, unmistakable to anyone who knows what they're looking at. He can't do this to me, Kennedy says. What follows is 13 days that remain the closest the world has ever officially come to nuclear war. The story is well known in outline. The American naval blockade, the Soviet ships approaching, the secret negotiations, Khrushchev's letters, the resolution. But the outline conceals how many times during those 13 days the situation came within moments of catastrophic miscalculation. On October 27th, Black Saturday, 3 separate incidents occur simultaneously, any one of which could have triggered nuclear war. At 9 o'clock in the morning, a U-2 spy plane piloted by Major Rudolph Anderson is shot down over Cuba by a Soviet surface-to-air missile. Anderson is killed. The XCOM, Kennedy's Crisis Advisory Group, has previously agreed that if an American aircraft is shot down over Cuba, the United States will immediately attack the SAM site responsible. Kennedy, in the room, looks at his advisors. He does not give the order. He waits. He wants to know more before he acts. The order is never given. The SAM site is never attacked. What Kennedy doesn't know, what no one in Washington knows, is that the decision to fire the missile was made locally by Soviet commanders in Cuba without authorization from Moscow. Khrushchev did not order the shoot-down. The local commanders did it on their own. At the same time, a different U-2, on a routine air sampling mission over the Arctic, accidentally strays into Soviet airspace over the Chukotka Peninsula. Soviet interceptors scramble. American interceptors scramble to escort the U-2 back to friendly airspace. For approximately 30 minutes, American and Soviet fighter aircraft are in close proximity over Soviet territory. If anyone fires, the incident is indistinguishable from the opening of a war. No one fires. The U-2 navigates back out of Soviet airspace. The incident is classified immediately and not revealed publicly for decades. But it is the third incident on Black Saturday that comes closest to ending the world, and it takes place not in the skies, but 300 feet underwater. The B-59 is a Foxtrot-class Soviet submarine. It has been underwater for weeks. It is running low on batteries and low on air. The temperature inside the hull has reached 60 degrees Celsius in some compartments. Men are passing out from heat and carbon dioxide buildup. The captain, Valentin Savitsky, has not been able to make radio contact with Moscow for days. He does not know what is happening on the surface. He does not know that the crisis has escalated to the brink. He does not know that negotiations are ongoing. What he knows is this: American warships are above him, dropping signaling depth charges, small explosive devices designed to force the submarine to surface for identification. The depth charges are not intended to damage the submarine. Savitsky does not know this. To him, in the dark, running out of air, unable to contact Moscow, The depth charges feel like the opening of an attack. Captain Savitsky makes a decision. The B-59 is carrying a nuclear torpedo. A single T-5 torpedo with a warhead of approximately 10 kilotons, comparable to the bomb that destroyed Hiroshima. Savitsky orders it armed. His intention is to fire it at the American warships above him. Under Soviet Navy regulations at the time, the launch of a nuclear weapon required the agreement of 3 officers: the captain, the political officer, and the brigade commander. The political officer, Ivan Maslenikov, agrees with Savitsky. If both of them concur, the torpedo fires. The brigade commander on board the B-59 is Vasily Arkhipov. Vasily Arkhipov says no. He argues with Savitsky for what witnesses later describe as an agonizing period. Savitsky is convinced they are under attack. He is exhausted, overheated, cut off from command. He believes he may be firing the first shot of a war that has already begun on the surface without his knowledge. Arkhipov tells him, "We don't know what's happening up there. We need to surface and find out before we fire a nuclear weapon. We need to make contact. We need information." Savitsky relents. The B-59 surfaces. American warships surround it. No shots are fired. Radio contact is eventually established. The submarine eventually returns to the Soviet Union. If Vasily Arkhipov had said yes, or if he had simply not been on that submarine, which was almost the case, his assignment to the B-59 was a last-minute decision. A nuclear torpedo would have detonated in the middle of the American naval blockade. The response from the American surface fleet would have been immediate. The response from Washington would have followed within minutes. And the Soviet response to that response, with over 40,000 nuclear warheads on hair-trigger alert, would have ended human civilization as we know it. Vasily Arkhipov died in 1998. He received a minor Soviet naval commendation sometime after the crisis, though the full details of what he did were classified for decades. When the story finally became known in the West, Thomas Blanton, the director of the National Security Archive, said of Arkhipov, "A man named Vasily Arkhipov saved the world. He is not in your history textbook." September 26, 1983. 0:15 Moscow time. Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov is the duty officer at Serpukhov 15, a secret Soviet nuclear early warning facility located in a bunker south of Moscow. His job is to monitor the OKO satellite system, a network of Soviet satellites designed to detect the launch of American intercontinental ballistic missiles. At 0:15, the alarm goes off. The system is reporting the launch of an American Minuteman ICBM from a base in the United States. The alert level is the highest possible. The system is not reporting a malfunction or an anomaly. It is reporting a confirmed missile launch. Petrov has approximately 15 to 20 minutes before the missile, if real, hits Soviet territory. His job is to report the launch to his superiors immediately so that the Soviet leadership can authorize a retaliatory strike before their own missiles are destroyed on the ground. Soviet nuclear doctrine at the time operates on a launch-on-warning basis. If you receive confirmed warning of an attack, you launch before the incoming missiles arrive. Petrov picks up the phone. He does not report the launch. Instead, he stares at the screen. Something is wrong. The system is showing one missile. American nuclear doctrine, which Soviet analysts know in detail, does not involve launching a single missile. If the Americans were attacking, they would launch hundreds simultaneously to overwhelm Soviet defenses. One missile makes no sense. He also knows, because he was involved in the development of the OKO system, that it has bugs. It has produced false positives before. The ground radar systems, which would provide independent confirmation, are not yet showing anything. The alarm escalates. Now the system is showing 5 missiles. 5 missiles is a more plausible attack profile than 1. Petrov is aware of this. He is also aware that if he reports the launch and it is real, the Soviet response will be automatic and total. And he is aware that if he does not report the launch and it is real, he will have failed in his duty and the Soviet Union will be destroyed without the ability to respond. He decides it is a false alarm. He reports a system malfunction. He sits in his chair, sweating, for the next several minutes, watching the screens, waiting to find out if he has just made the worst decision in human history. No missiles arrive. The OKO system had malfunctioned. A rare alignment of sunlight reflected off high-altitude clouds had been interpreted by the satellite sensors as the exhaust plume of a launching ICBM. The ground radar systems, which would have caught the error, had not yet had time to confirm or deny. Stanislav Petrov had made his decision without ground radar confirmation. He had made it based on logic, instinct, and a knowledge of the system's flaws. He had made it alone, in a bunker, in the middle of the night, with 15 minutes and no one to consult. After the incident, Petrov was neither punished nor decorated. The Soviet military conducted an investigation and found that he had technically violated protocol by not reporting the launch immediately. He was reprimanded for improper record-keeping during the incident. He had not filled out his logbook correctly in the chaos. He was not promoted. He was transferred to a less sensitive posting. He retired from the military without any formal recognition of what he had done. In 2004, he received an award from a German organization called the Association of World Citizens. In 2006, he was honored at the United Nations. In 2013, he received the Dresden Peace Prize. He died in May 2017 at the age of 77. His death was not widely reported. His neighbors in his apartment building outside Moscow did not know who he was. His name was Stanislav Petrov. He decided, alone in a bunker at midnight, not to end the world. November 1983. 2 months after Petrov's decision, NATO is conducting a military exercise called Able Archer 83, a command post exercise simulating the escalation from conventional war to nuclear war in Europe. The exercise is realistic to a degree that previous Able Archer exercises have not been. It uses new communication procedures. It involves radio silence at unusual times. It simulates the actual release procedures for nuclear weapons, including the use of real codes. In Moscow, the KGB and Soviet military intelligence are watching. The context is critical. The year 1983 has been, by any measure, the most terrifying year of the Cold War since the Cuban Missile Crisis. In March, President Reagan has called the Soviet Union an evil empire and announced the Strategic Defense Initiative, a missile defense system that the Soviets interpret as a first strike enabler, designed to shoot down their retaliatory missiles after an American first strike. In September, the Soviet Air Defense Forces have shot down Korean Airlines Flight 007, killing 269 people, after misidentifying it as an American spy plane, and the American response has been a propaganda onslaught that convinces many in Moscow that Washington is preparing for war. And on September 1, 1983, the same month as the KAL-007 shoot-down, the same month Petrov almost reported a nuclear launch, NATO deploys Pershing II ballistic missiles in West Germany. The Pershing II can reach Moscow in 6 minutes. 6 minutes from launch to impact. The Soviets have no early warning system capable of reliably detecting a Pershing II launch, which means, from the Soviet perspective, that the Americans now have a first strike weapon that could decapitate Soviet leadership before anyone can respond. Soviet military intelligence has been running an operation called Ryan since 1981, an acronym for Raketno-Yadernoi Napadny, nuclear missile attack. Its purpose is to detect the indicators of an imminent American first strike. KGB officers at Soviet embassies around the world are required to monitor specific indicators: the movement of blood supplies to military bases, the behavior patterns of senior American officials, the lighting patterns in Pentagon windows at night. They are looking for signs that the Americans are preparing to launch. In November 1983, during Able Archer 83, the indicators start appearing. NATO aircraft are moving in unusual patterns. Communication procedures have changed. There are periods of radio silence consistent with pre-strike protocols. American and British officials are participating in the exercise with an unusual level of senior involvement, including, in some versions of the exercise, simulated involvement of political leadership. Several Soviet military units in East Germany and Poland go to increased alert. Soviet aircraft in the region are armed with nuclear weapons and placed on runway alert, ready to launch on short notice. For approximately 10 days, the Soviet military is partially mobilized on the assumption that Able Archer 83 may not be an exercise at all. What prevents the situation from escalating further is, in part, a British intelligence asset inside Soviet intelligence, Oleg Gordievsky, a KGB officer who has been working for MI6 since 1974. Gordievsky reports to British intelligence that the Soviets are genuinely alarmed, that Ryan is producing real alerts, and that the leadership in Moscow is interpreting Able Archer as potential cover for a real attack. The British passed this information to the Americans. Reagan, who has been briefed on Gordievsky's reporting, is reportedly genuinely shocked. He had not understood that the Soviets believed, even partially, that the United States might actually be planning a first strike. He had thought the evil empire rhetoric was politics. He begins to understand that the Soviets took it as strategic communication. The exercise ends on November 11th. Soviet alert levels return to normal. The crisis, which most of the world never knew was happening, dissipates without a shot fired. But the Able Archer scare changes Reagan. His diary entries from late 1983 show a president who has been genuinely frightened, not by what he intended, but by what the Soviets perceived. He becomes more interested in direct communication with Soviet leadership. He writes in his diary, "I feel the Soviets are so defense-minded, so paranoid about being attacked, that without being in any way soft on them, we ought to tell them no one here has any intention of doing anything like that." Within 3 years, he is sitting across a table from Mikhail Gorbachev in Reykjavik, Iceland, discussing the elimination of all nuclear weapons. The line from Able Archer to Reykjavik runs directly through the fear of one leader who finally understood what the other side was afraid of. January 25, 1995. The Cold War has been over for 4 years. The Soviet Union has ceased to exist. Boris Yeltsin is the president of Russia. The nuclear arsenals are still there. Both sides still have thousands of warheads on hair-trigger alert. But the political relationship has changed beyond recognition. On this morning, Norwegian and American scientists launch a research rocket from the Andøya rocket range in Norway. The rocket, a Black Brant 12, designed to study the aurora borealis, follows a flight path that takes it over the Barents Sea toward the northwest. Russian radar operators, tracking the rocket, observe a trajectory that looks, in the first minutes of flight, identical to the trajectory of an American submarine-launched Trident missile on a decapitation strike, a missile aimed at Moscow, designed to destroy Russian leadership before they can authorize a retaliation. The radar operators report upward through the chain of command. Within minutes, the Russian nuclear command, the Chaget, what is colloquially called the nuclear briefcase, is opened and presented to Boris Yeltsin. Boris Yeltsin becomes the first Russian or Soviet leader to have the nuclear briefcase opened in a real emergency situation. He has a matter of minutes to decide whether to authorize a retaliatory launch. Norway had notified Russia of the planned rocket launch weeks in advance through the proper diplomatic channels. The notification had not reached the radar operators. It had been filed in a bureaucratic system and had not made it to the people who needed to know. Yeltsin watches the radar track. His military advisors are with him. The window for decision is closing. Then the radar data changes. The rocket trajectory diverges from the expected path of a Trident missile. It is not heading toward Russia. It is heading toward the Norwegian Sea, upward, away. It is a research rocket. Yeltsin does not authorize a launch. The briefcase is closed. The all-clear is given. The incident lasts approximately 8 minutes from initial alert to resolution. 8 minutes during which the president of Russia had his hand on the nuclear trigger based on faulty information caused by a bureaucratic failure in the routine notification of a scientific experiment. The Cold War was over. The weapons were still there. The systems were still running. The hair triggers were still set. They still are. The official history of the Cold War is a history of leaders. Truman and Stalin, Eisenhower and Khrushchev, Kennedy and Khrushchev again, Nixon and Brezhnev, Reagan and Gorbachev. The story is told as a story of summits, treaties, policy decisions, and ideological conflict. This is not the whole story. The whole story includes Vasily Arkhipov on a submarine in the Caribbean saying no. It includes Stanislav Petrov in a bunker outside Moscow, deciding not to report a launch that his instruments were screaming at him to report. It includes Oleg Penkovsky, a Soviet military intelligence colonel who, from 1961 to 1962, passed to British and American intelligence a complete picture of Soviet military capabilities, including the fact that Soviet missiles in Cuba were not yet operational during the first days of the crisis. This information, that the missiles couldn't actually be fired yet, gave Kennedy room to negotiate that he might not have taken if he had believed the missiles were ready to launch. It includes Vasily Mitrokhin, a KGB archivist who spent 12 years secretly copying by hand the KGB's most sensitive files, smuggling the notes home in his boots, hiding them under the floorboards of his dacha, and eventually delivering them to British intelligence in 1992, providing the most complete picture of Soviet intelligence operations ever assembled. It includes the unnamed American Navy officers who, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, dropped signaling depth charges on Soviet submarines without being told that at least one of those submarines was carrying a nuclear torpedo and that the submarine commander had, at one point, intended to fire it. It includes the East German border guard who, on the night of November 9, 1989, faced with a crowd of thousands of East Germans demanding to cross into West Berlin, called his superior to ask for orders, received no clear answer, and decided on his own to open the gate. His name was Harold Jaeger. He has said in interviews that he thought, "If I don't open the gate, someone is going to get killed." He opened the gate. The Berlin Wall fell. History is made by individuals, not by systems, not by ideologies, not by the abstract forces that political scientists map and economists model. By people, specific, mortal, frightened, tired, imperfect people who are placed in moments where their decision determines what happens next. The Cold War was not managed into a safe conclusion. It lurched from crisis to crisis, held together by luck, by individual judgment, and by the repeated, unreliable, never guaranteed decision of one person at a time to choose restraint over reaction. We got through it. We don't entirely know why. It is 2024, and the world still has approximately 12,500 nuclear warheads. Russia has roughly 5,580. The United States has 5,044. China is expanding its arsenal rapidly and is projected to have 1,000 warheads by 2030. 9 countries in total have nuclear weapons. The treaties that govern the Cold War nuclear relationship, START, INF, Open Skies, have been suspended, withdrawn from, or allowed to expire. There is currently no binding arms control agreement between the United States and Russia. The hair-trigger alert posture, the readiness to launch within minutes of a warning, remains in place for both American and Russian nuclear forces. Approximately 1,800 warheads on each side are ready to launch within minutes. The systems that produced the false alarm Petrov saw in 1983 have been updated and improved. But updated systems can produce new kinds of errors. The bureaucratic failure that caused the Norwegian rocket incident in 1995, a notification not passed to the right people, is the kind of error that better technology does not prevent because it is a human and institutional error, not a technical one. We are not living in the Cold War. The political context is different. The ideological conflict is different. The scale of the confrontation is different. But the weapons are the same. The physics is the same. A 10-kiloton nuclear weapon detonated over a modern city produces the same result in 2024 that it produced in 1945. Approximately 80,000 dead in the first seconds. Another 80,000 in the following months. And that is a small weapon by modern standards, a tactical nuclear device, the kind that military planners now discuss using in a limited nuclear exchange, as if nuclear exchange admits of limitation. The people who stood in the gaps, Arkhipov, Petrov, Jaeger, the unnamed officers and analysts and operators who chose caution over certainty, were not heroes in the conventional sense. They were not brave in the way soldiers are brave. They were people who, in a specific moment, had better information or better judgment or better values than the system around them, and who acted on that rather than on the system's instructions. We survived the Cold War because we were lucky, and because, at the critical moments, we happened to have the right people in the right places. We should not count on being that lucky again. The stories in this documentary are not history in the sense of things safely passed. They are instructions. They are a record of what happens when the system fails and everything comes down to one person. They are a reminder that the weapons are still there, the systems are still running, and somewhere, right now, there is a duty officer in a bunker looking at a screen, making a decision that the rest of us will never know about. The Cold War ended. The danger didn't. If this documentary made you think, leave a comment below. The conversation that follows might be the most important one you have today. And if you want more history that doesn't make it into the textbooks, you know where to find us.